humanity and goodness. That's all we're doing here. Hi, everybody. I'm your host, Shirin Yadigar, and you're watching Moms Matter. And all the way from Israel, we have human rights activist and journalist Emily Schrader. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Happy to be here.
You are incredible. I've been watching you for years, and you've shared that you made Aliyah 9 years ago during the war because it was so hard for you to stay here and stomach it. You needed to be there. Mm-hmm. And you were there on October 7th.
Of course, yeah.
Tell us, as a journalist, what has unfolded for you and what you've seen in the past 2 months.
Oof. How long do you have?
I mean, as a human rights activist, as a women's rights activist, what is it that you've seen?
Well, if I had to put it in one word, it would be trauma. I've experienced a lot of wars, even in the time that I've lived in Israel. I've experienced rocket fire. I have been near or witnessed terrorist attacks multiple times. I've never seen anything like this. The level of depravity, of cruelty, of disregard for human life is really unmatched by anything that I've seen except for two entities, the Islamic Republic of Iran and ISIS. And I would put them all in the same category. Oh, and also let's throw in Nazis. I think it's fair to say that the behavior that they carried out was pretty Nazi-like. They drugged themselves, Captagon, so that they would be even more removed from any inhibitions. This is something we've seen terrorist organizations using throughout the Middle East. And then they, raided the border, the Gaza border, into Israeli communities. Not military bases. It was not a strategic objective to take land or to launch a war for Palestine. It was none of those things. It was a coordinated terrorist attack against innocent civilians, most of whom were men, women, children, elderly. Hundreds of them were taken captive. Many of them, also including men, women, and children, were sexually assaulted. Gang raped in some cases. But I think the thing that really horrified me the most when I was in Kfar Aza, one of the communities that was hardest hit, and also in Kibbutz Be'eri, another one that suffered some of the highest number of casualties. 10% of their entire community was killed in these attacks, and multiple more. Some of them are still in Gaza as hostages. But what really stuck with me is that they took such enjoyment out of it. And I think that's what separates this from other terrible atrocities that happen throughout the world, which do happen. But to celebrate and to express like joy over murdering people, it's shocking. It's shocking to me.
I mean, you're talking about a terrorist organization that is funded by Iran. Well, you talk about this all the time, and you've been really covering this. You understand it really well. So can you explain to us in a nutshell? Obviously, this is a much longer conversation, but in a nutshell, for people who don't understand what Hamas is and how they're being funded and what's happening, can you give us a quick recap of that?
Yeah, so Hamas is an Islamist terrorist organization, which is technically an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're Sunni, so they shouldn't work with Iran. However, because many other Arab states, especially more moderate Arab states like the Emirates and Bahrain, have really shied away from this sort of extremist terrorism, they turn to other radical funding sources, and not just funding anymore. It's also physical training. We know that many of the Hamas terrorists actually received training in Iran. The Hamas leaders were meeting with officials of the Islamic Republic in Syria just a couple of weeks before the October 7th massacre. The Ayatollah himself was tweeting about how something was coming on social media days before October 7th. So the connections between these two organizations is very strong. The last year they gave them $100 million in funding, and that's just what's known so far. We also know, of course, they've provided support in other ways. And Iran is very creative. I mean, they're no dummies, that's for sure. They're very creative in the ways that they carry out and fund and support terrorism, and not just in Hamas. They also fund and support Islamic Jihad, which is another terrorist organization in Gaza and also in the West Bank. Of course, the Houthis in Yemen. the Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, and also Syrian militias, and of course Hezbollah in Lebanon. So we're talking about at least 5 different places in the Middle East that have been destabilized by the Iranian regime, essentially occupation of the Islamic Republic.
Wow.
So this is not just an Israeli problem. This is a problem in the entire region. It affects all of us, disproportionately women and children, disproportionately not Israelis. It's actually the Arab world that's suffering the most from the Islamic Republic and from these terrorist organizations. So it's not something exclusive to Israel. But of course, what we're seeing now is the byproduct of years of investment by the Islamic Republic in a terrorist organization that in their charter is fundamentally committed to destroying the state of Israel, to annihilating the Jewish people, that's their words, and to spreading this radical ideology throughout the Western world.
Right.
They're not just focused on Israel, they're focused on the entire Western world, including the United States.
That's right. That's right.
So
And
that's
I mean,
what I think people don't understand about this conflict. Hamas is your problem too.
absolutely. I mean, Hamas is just a proxy to Iran,
Yes.
like, right? And so as we've seen what Iran has done to the women of Iran, and we see now what Hamas did to the women in Israel, not just Israelis, but anyone they can get their hands on. And as a journalist, you've spoken to these victims.
Yeah.
You've spoken to their families. What are they sharing with you that we're not hearing?
I mean, there's a lot that hasn't come out yet. It's only started to come out about the sexual assault that took place. Also amongst the hostages, there were at least 10 of the hostages that were released initially in the humanitarian pause and fighting that they had. So many of these hostages confirmed, both male and female, by the way, that they were sexually assaulted while they were in captivity. So not just on October 7th. So this is a known phenomenon, and some of the stories that I was told, both from first responders who I've interviewed who were at the scene on October 7th, and also from both hostages who returned and hostages' families, there's a lot of very unpleasant and morbid descriptions of what happened that I won't get into here. To some of these girls, that's beyond comprehension in many cases. And I think one of the things that's the most difficult about situations, attacks like this and the situations that come as a byproduct is that many of the victims who suffered the worst forms of sexual assault and rape, including gang rape, were shot. They were killed at the scene on October 7th. And so we don't have some of those firsthand testimonies of survivors because they didn't survive. We have firsthand testimonies of eyewitnesses whom I also spoke to. And the descriptions of what they saw, I have goosebumps just thinking about it again. It's really beyond imagination. Like how you think to do the things that they did, it's mind-boggling. And I will tell you one more thing. I mentioned how the thing that sets this attack or series of attacks apart is how they relished it. They took pride and joy from what they were doing. And I was in one of the first briefings of the Israeli government where they played that 45-minute video of all the raw footage of the Hamas terrorists. And this is something really crazy if you think about it. Like, it's not Israeli reports or Israeli footage that's making these arguments. It's Hamas. Not only did they do it, they recorded it. They sent videos to everyone they know. It was on their Telegram channel. I know I'm on it. I follow it as a journalist. So I received this information in real time of what they're doing, and they're proud of it. They were proud of it.
They're proud of it, and yet all of the human rights organizations around the world are not condemning it. So we know this happened. We have proof of it. We can't argue that. Why is it, you're a human rights activist, you work with these organizations, why is it so hard for them to condemn a terrorist organization?
Well, I think because there is a battle of narratives, and they want to frame this issue as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's not.
No.
This is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a terrorist organization that has hijacked the Gaza Strip with the support of the Iranian regime. They do not represent the Palestinian people. They're not even the legitimate body to declare a war. They're not even the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority is, technically speaking. And so they obviously had no business doing what they're doing. This is strictly terrorism by any definition. And I think that people are mistaking what happened for a conflict over land or a conflict over Israel versus Palestine historically, and that's not the situation. And the unfortunate byproduct of that is that Israelis and Palestinians are dying as a result. And the more we have an international community that doesn't understand what it actually means to be pro-Palestinian,
Right.
the more we're going to see this. And honestly, as an Israeli, I'm saying this, I fully support the IDF. I do support what they're doing because we must get rid of Hamas. But my heart breaks for the Palestinian people. And I do think that the Palestinians in Gaza deserve better leaders. And it's crazy that the international community wouldn't be supporting this.
I mean, it's shocking to me, but you just said something that I'm not sure most people understand. You said that Hamas is not the authority of the Palestinian people. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because we hear that there's a democracy in the fact that they have voted for their leadership and they have voted for Hamas. So are you saying that that's inaccurate and that...
There haven't been elections pretty much since Israel withdrew. That's the only election there ever was. Hamas did democratically win the election. Immediately after, they murdered all of their political opponents. So it's interesting, like you win the election and then you kill your... But also Iran style. Not Iran, sorry, the Islamic Republic style. But yeah, that is true, that initially they were democratically elected, but only in Gaza. In the West Bank, they were not. And the internationally recognized representative of the Palestinians is the Palestinian Authority, and who their leader is Mahmoud Abbas from Fatah, which is the political rival of Hamas. Now, of course, Hamas exists in the West Bank as well, but they're not in power. And there has been an ongoing bitter rivalry between the two. They hate each other much more than they hate Israel. They've been playing games with the lives of the Palestinian people for decades. And I will give you a quick example. We constantly hear about the water situation and the electricity in Gaza. Right. It might surprise some of the people watching to know that the water, only 10% is actually supplied by Israel. And when it comes to electricity, only 40% is supplied by Israel. And the remainder of that is provided by it's paid for by the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate entity responsible for the Palestinian people. However, because Hamas has refused to develop further infrastructure, to rebuild the water aquifers in order to provide clean water and sanitation, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza has intensified, even before October 7th, has intensified to a level that's almost unsustainable. It's terrible. It's a terrible, terrible situation. And rather than invest in rebuilding that and then Hamas gets credit in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority says, no, we're not going to involve ourselves in that, even if it means the Palestinian people suffer and die, because we don't want Hamas to be successful.
I mean...
and this is the same tactic we've seen the rivaling political parties within Palestinian society for decades. And it's the innocent people who pay the price, and that's really, really sad. And despite all this, and despite repeated wars, and despite terrorist organizations, Israel has overseen transfer of humanitarian aid on a daily basis. They are doing all that they can within the limitations that they have. It's a difficult situation, impossibly difficult for most people to understand. But at the end of the day, Israel does not have an obligation to protect Palestinian people. The Palestinian leaders do. Israel does have an obligation to protect its citizens, both Arab and Jewish, from the threat of terrorism.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think what you're saying, and most people don't understand, is that the villain here is Hamas, is the Palestinian Authority. They're not taking care of their people. They're using their people as human shields and blaming the IDF and Israel for all their problems, which is not the case. And you just told me before we came on that you were in Gaza a month after the war.
Yes.
You were there as a journalist.
Yep.
What are the people on the ground in Gaza saying? I mean, they voted these people in. They're miserable. What are they saying? What do they want?
So it's very divided right now, probably more so than ever before. There is a significant portion of Palestinians in Gaza who support Hamas. There is. We saw it on the streets on October 7th. We saw people celebrating. We saw people passing out candy. Yeah. So this sentiment definitely exists. I think it's a slight majority in the Gaza Strip, according to recent polling. However, that's dropping pretty rapidly, as you can imagine, because Hamas has brought absolute hell on the people of Gaza. And I think that they're starting to understand that and why that's so problematic. I wish it didn't take something like this to get them to that point. But there are many, many people in Gaza who oppose Hamas, who don't want to live in this reality, who simply want to live their lives in peace and, you know, as much prosperity as they can. And Hamas has prevented them from doing that. On the ground in Gaza, when I was there, I only spoke very briefly to people because of the security situation, sure. But I was accompanying an IDF soldiers on a humanitarian mission. So what they were doing during that those few hours that I was in Gaza was to the south at the time. It was a route that had actually been fired on by Hamas several days before against their own people. Because before the IDF does anything militarily, they, especially if it's like a business with a lot of buildings, they'll call them, they'll tell them to evacuate. They will also drop flyers saying like at X time, we will be conducting an operation, please evacuate the area. And in addition to that, they also do roof knocking, which is when they bomb like the top part of a building, which is with like a much smaller munitions as a warning. And then they have a certain amount of time to evacuate the building for anyone who remains. There is no army in the world that takes these kinds of precautions when they're carrying out any kind of airstrikes. Despite that, we unfortunately still see civilian casualties. And part of that is because Gaza is incredibly dense and you can't avoid it in some circumstances. And in other cases, it's intentional because Hamas is putting rockets, they're putting command and control centers, they're putting weapons, munitions, storage in mosques, in hospitals, below hospitals, in schools, in UNRWA schools even, in UN facilities. So these are all things that we've seen in the past and also currently. And by the way, it's also a tactic that we know the Islamic Republic does. So, you know, like father, like son. But yeah, it's a terrible situation. It's a terrible situation.
My heart breaks for everyone in the region. You can't watch that and not have a bleeding heart. It's impossible. Yeah. What's your message as a journalist, as a human rights activist to all of these young college students around the world, all of these people at the rallies that are chanting and rallying for the Palestinian people who really don't know the truth and don't know the facts? What's your message to them?
I think I want to urge people to, first of all, do your research about this actual issue. And second of all, shy away from inflammatory rhetoric. We've seen a lot of this even from some of the top levels. You have members of Congress like Rashida Tlaib who continue to use inaccurate and inflammatory language about this conflict that doesn't apply to the situation, that makes everyone more upset. And the byproduct of that, as we've seen in, you know, throughout the international community, across Jewish communities globally, is an increase in anti-Semitism. Right. And that's very demonstrable with every single operation that happens in Gaza. We have seen Jews being attacked in the streets, which is clear-cut anti-Semitism. We're not talking about Israelis walking down the street. No. We're not talking about IDF soldiers. We're talking about random people who are targeted because they are Jewish. That's right. This is anti-Semitism. This is a byproduct of the incitement, of the lazy language that people use when they speak about Israel because they can't be bothered to research the actual facts about what's happening. So be responsible. Don't go with the flow and say, oh, well, so-and-so told me that it's apartheid and genocide and ethnic cleansing. No, it's not. And it's not because everything Israel does is right. Israel may do things that are wrong. You can even have a fundamental problem with the state of Israel. But you cannot accuse Israel of committing a genocide or committing ethnic cleansing or committing apartheid because those are not accurate terms. They have definitions and they do not apply to the situation, whether or not Israel is right or wrong. And if you want to hold Israel accountable for things that you think Israel is doing wrong, exaggerating about it is doing the opposite. Because you are, as an Israeli, I'm begging you, I have been many criticisms of my country, but we can't deal with these issues when people are constantly spreading things that are not true about Israel. And I would like to be able to deal with incidents of discrimination or of racism or take your pick. We have plenty of problems, but it's not the same thing as having an apartheid state. So people need to be a lot more responsible about this issue in general.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You are brilliant. and so dedicated. And we've been watching you. And I really urge everyone out there to follow Emily if you don't, because you're really putting out real information. You're getting through that misinformation out there. And I think you're really just an asset to the world and to humanity at large. And I thank you for all the great work you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you again for being here. Safe travels back.
Thank you.
You saw it right here on Moms Matter, and we'll see you guys.